Well, good morning, everybody. It's encouraging that the microphone is working. And again, I apologize for the fiasco on Wednesday, but lessons learned, I'm sure. And I just wanted to thank you all for being such a wonderfully loyal and responsive audience. And it makes it a great pleasure for me to be able to exchange these ideas with you. And I thank you all for sticking it out. Thank you. So today, then, we're going to draw the threads together of all the cross-currents that we've been talking about, and I thought nothing epitomizes more as a subject than Art Nouveau, where it came from and what it led to. And Art Nouveau was an art movement. It really was a decorative style more than an art movement that flourished in the last 2 decades of the 19th century and into the first decade of the 20th century, and then abruptly disappeared for reasons that we will see in a moment. But it's epitomized in this painting by Renoir. Parisians traveling up to Montmartre on a Sunday afternoon to dance under the dappled light of the Moulin de la Galette, very much epitomizing the belle époque of the fin de siècle Paris. So where did all this come from? Well, its first manifestation in Paris, here we see a doorway of an apartment building with the luscious curves going over and the bust over the door there, inviting you inside with the 2 eyes over the door. When this building first appeared in Paris, it was an absolute scandal. But it was very seductive. And before long, restaurants were fitting themselves out in these luscious curves, inviting, embracing the customers. Maxime's was the most popular of all, and their well-heeled clients would sit down in these cosseted surroundings, eating their foie gras and sipping their champagne. But Art Nouveau spread very, very quickly from just architecture to furniture, and here we see a cabinet, just a simple wall cabinet, and it looks to me as if that is hovering against the wall rather than being attached to it. And this is the magic of this movement, that it really does capture this sense of movement and space. And it was really summarized very nicely in this line drawing, just an ink drawing by a German designer, Marius Behner. And Marius Behner captures the essence. If you say, what is the essence of Art Nouveau? It's this curving line, the smoke coming up from a candle, a little bit of wind, the smoke wafts around and produces these lovely curves. And this is really the essence of the movement that we're going to see manifest in different ways. And one of the beauties of Art Nouveau is that it was manifest in many different ways according to the idiosyncrasies of the artist, whether that was a graphic artist or an architect. Its roots really start in the Industrial Revolution, a complete paradox, but not so much a paradox if you regard it as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. And this, in the middle of the 19th century, is a romanticized version of what it's like to work in an iron foundry. And there you can see the boss at the back there, right in the very, very center in the background of the picture there, with his top hat, his hand raised, waving to his loyal workers who are toiling away happily with these barrels of molten iron. The reality, of course, was completely different. It was hard work, it was noisy, it was very dangerous, it was poorly paid, and the accommodations in which the workers lived were abysmal. So much so that John Ruskin, the leading art critic of the middle of the 19th century in England, was so appalled that the toll that the Industrial Revolution was taking on the social fabric and moral fabric of British society. And he advocated in his writings a return to the days of old, of the Middle Ages, romanticizing, if you like. He was an Oxford-educated literary critic and art critic, and he was used to living in an ivory tower. He looked down at what was going on, appalled at the sight, and advocated something equally romantic as a solution, and that is we should revert to the craftsmen who built the original Gothic cathedrals. A lovely concept, but as romantic as the picture that we just saw. But nonetheless, he had a point. And sharing that point was the young English architect Augustus Pugin, who was invited, among other architects, to submit designs for the recently burnt down Houses of Parliament in London, which succumbed to a catastrophic fire in 1834. And Ruskin's advocation for the Gothic meshed very much with Pugin's feel for the Gothic as well, and here is one of his designs that were incorporated into the new building of the Houses of Parliament as we see them today, Neo-Gothic. And that Neo-Gothic revival that appears in so many buildings in London, which you may well be familiar with, St Pancras Station, for example, the old Prudential Insurance Company, this Gothic revival was largely owing to Pugin. In keeping with that spirit, it was also very much, the medieval period was very much a period that corresponded with the sensitivities of the Pre-Raphaelite painters. So now we see a number of different things coming together. And they were particularly enamored of the stories, the mythical stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Guinevere and the noble deeds. And here this is a sort of Pre-Raphaelite painting that is in parallel, if you like, with Pugin's reconstruction, partial reconstruction of the Houses of Parliament. The real turning point came in 1851 with the great exhibition held in Hyde Park in Paxton's glass and iron palace, known affectionately as the Crystal Palace. And this exhibition ran for 6 months in Hyde Park, attracting some 6 million visitors, and Queen Victoria herself came on 4 separate occasions. And inside, under Paxton's glass canopy, there were exhibits from no fewer than 26 nations proclaiming the triumph of industrialization. Britain, of course, was the main exhibitor there, showing off a working cotton machinery from a working cotton mill, and pride of place was given to the new and fangled invention of the penny pay toilet. Visiting this exhibition was Owen Jones. Owen Jones is one of England's leading designers, and he was appalled at what he saw being churned out in the factories for decoration for Victorian homes, which were proudly exhibited as a product of British industry. And the Victorians liked things over the top, flowers upon flowers and curls and cherubs and all sorts of things. And he was appalled not only at the lack of taste of design, but also the poor quality of the workmanship, machines churning these out. And he was very much of the same spirit as John Ruskin, advocating for the return to artisanship. And he published his thoughts in what was called, he called rather quaintly, the Grammar of Ornament. And it was an academic study, a large book, fully illustrated, and the main theme of the Grammar of Ornament was that good taste came from observing nature. And he was advocating that strongly, and he also recognized the importance of Islamic calligraphy and how that had evolved into arabesques that we had seen, again, reflecting nature in its own idiosyncratic way. And so this was the theme, and this book by Owen Jones resonated enormously with this man, William Morris, the founder of the British arts and craft movement. And this is where Art Nouveau really began in earnest. He, like Ruskin, was on a mission, and the mission was to reverse the horrors of industrialization. Meritorious, but idealistic, of course. He was Oxford educated, and he went to Oxford to read ancient history, and he got bored with Greek and Latin, but instead was fascinated by medieval England and the Knights of the Round Table, which epitomized that in his imagination. And in his design, among one of his fellow students was Edward Burne-Jones, whose name you may recall as being a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And the two of them became lifelong friends. Burne-Jones eventually joined the Brotherhood formally. He was one of the last members of the Brotherhood. And what were the Brotherhood all about? You can see here, referring back to the time of the medieval period, and this is an illustration of the wizard Merlin, who features in the tales of King Arthur, the wizard Merlin being beguiled by a lady there in one of the tales. The founder of that movement was an English-born son of Italian immigrants, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And what seized Rossetti was his resentment, his anger at what he regarded as the carnal nudity of the Renaissance. Well, he was having a go at Michelangelo, but I suppose he was a bit hesitant to accuse Michelangelo of being decadent with the carnal nudity, so he had to go at Raphael, who did far fewer nudes. So this became not the pre-Michelangelo movement, but the pre-Raphaelite movement, and I never quite understood why he chose Raphael, but there we are. But what was his aesthetic principle? Well, first of all, number one was to clothe the ladies, and there they're clothed, and he renders the details of their clothing, the silks there, magnificently, as you can see. Furthermore, these were all beautiful women, but they were wistful, looking back to the times of the past. And that's the theme that comes through all the Pre-Raphaelite paintings. And then he situates them in lush nature, the flowers and the plants there, beautifully rendered. William Morris, at the end of his graduation, was destined to be an architect. That's what he thought he wanted to do. But he found that that was a bit unsatisfactory, and he really was a bit of a loss of what to do. And Rossetti and Burne-Jones said to him, why don't you try painting? And here is William Morris's attempt at a Pre-Raphaelite painting influenced by his two friends. And it's this tale of Tristan and Isolde as portrayed in Wagner's opera, but it's originally a Nordic tale, as you probably know, Tristan and Isolde. And here is Isolde. Again, he tries to capture the wistful, languid look, but it doesn't quite come off, and he knew it. Burne-Jones, meanwhile, revived almost single-handedly the lost art of stained glass in England. And William Morris helped him with that, doing some designs for him, and together they produced these stained glass windows and also illuminated manuscripts, again very much in keeping with the Gothic theme that they thought was so important to regenerate. William Morris, Rossetti, and Burne-Jones together decided that William Morris's desire to do something other than painting, his desire was to do interior design. That's where he thought his future lay, and indeed it was. The three of them together formed what was known as the firm. And the firm was a commercial enterprise in which they recruited craftsmen in all different materials, using the finest materials, and the object was to produce things for the house, replacing the Victorian baubles that were so offensive to so many, replacing them that were both useful and aesthetically pleasing. And they thrived, and this is the first drawing that William Morris did of the production line that would make his reputation nationally and internationally, and that was in wallpaper. And here is William Morris's first design for wallpaper, and you can see, adhering to the grammar of ornament that Owen Jones had advocated as a reaction to the horror at what he'd seen in the 1851 exhibition, we can see now we're reverting to nature. And the serpiginous forms of the rose bush here, do you see, seen and accentuated against the rigidity of the trellis work. That was enormously successful, so much so that William Morris bought out his two partners, bought a store in Regent Street in London in which he said it was called Everything for the Home. And he still adhered to that same principle, that these were craft works to be done by craftsmen using the finest materials. His most successful of all wallpapers, which has survived, what is it now, 150 years, is his acanthus leaves. And you can see where he's coming from in terms of nature, and referring back to the Islamic talk the Islamic presentation on Wednesday, we could see that nature coming into the calligraphy, deriving from the calligraphy into arabesques. And here we can see that those same serpiginous forms in this very successful wallpaper. He was also very taken by William Blake, the mystical poet artist. And William Blake did many illustrations of his poems, as you know, and many of them were these wavering forms. Here a cave with wavering trees, other of his poems illustrated by swirling vortices. And that very much touched the sensitivity of William Morris in his design. But William Morris now faced a paradox. The paradox was his work was so popular among the people who could afford to buy it Why were these works so expensive? Because they were done by artisans, by hand, the finest materials, and it was absolutely abhorrent to think that this should be turned into an industrial process. Yet, the only way it could be made accessible to the people for whom it was designed was to industrialize. And to some extent he had to do this, and this was a conflict he could never resolve. He turns instead to social activism. He had read Marx, he had read Engels, he had visited on travels to the north of England the factories, the iron foundries, and could see himself the conditions of the workers. And he was an avowed socialist of the most left extreme. He was appalled to the impotence of the political parties in Westminster to do anything about the condition of the working class. So he sets up his own socialist league with some like-minded people, publishes their manifesto here, as you can see. And he not only published the manifesto, he went to working men's clubs to give speeches. He joined workers on strike in the picket line, giving speeches, and on soapboxes on street corners. Political activism would occupy him for 10 years because he had failed to reconcile his art with the politics and the reality of improving the situation for the working man and the quality of life in their homes. In his last decade, he turns away from social activism because he could see it was not having any effect, and reverts to where his heart really lay, and that is in the artisanal production of items for the home, now going into printing. And he established what was known, and still is known today, as the Kelmscott Press. Kelmscott is a little village in the Cotswolds in Britain, where he'd had a home for many years. And the principle here was the original principle that he had started with the firm way back. And that was everything would be produced by hand, it would all respect nature, and it would be on the finest materials. He published this was a commercial publishing house on a very small scale. I suppose you would call it a boutique publisher now. He produced a magnificent volume of Chaucer on vellum, can you believe? And similarly, he did this page here, which was taken from John Ruskin's monograph on the nature of Gothic. And what's so interesting, it's on handmade paper, printed on handmade paper, in the style of a medieval English manuscript. And you can see the text there is in a little rectangular box with a highly illuminated first capital letter there for W of we are now about to enter upon examination, etc. And look at the border. Pure floral border, arabesques that we've seen. And where did we see that before? We saw it on Wednesday, and we saw it on Wednesday because it's in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, dating 1,000 years earlier. The same arabesques that Morris now rediscovered. I don't know that he'd ever been outside England, let alone to see the Damascus Mosque. But you can see now the linkage between Arabic calligraphy. This all started with calligraphy, the Quran, remember. You had to have a script that was worthy of the word of Allah transmitted to Muhammad. And so it had to be in a special form, and that developed into arabesques. And here we are in the mosque. Ooh. And here we are with William Morris. Almost identical. It's quite uncanny, isn't it? Other influences came into play as well. Just about this time, you remember, the Japanese woodblock prints were coming in, and there's our friend Hokusai and one of the many manifestations of his great wave. Again, the curls and everything else. It was all very much of the spirit of the times, and this was also a factor that was going to influence the graphic artists of the Art Nouveau period, and even the architects to some extent. And coming in with the woodblock prints from Japan were, of course, the Japanese ceramics. And here's Christopher Dresser, an English designer, who copies the Japanese aesthetic with tendrils coming in. And you can see how the spirit is beginning to creep in now into everyday wares in England beyond William Morris. And not only is it from the Islamic world of the Middle East that we saw, but also from Iran. And here we see a room, a peacock room. The peacock is an important decorative motif in Islamic architecture in Iran. And this was adopted also by the Art Nouveau artists, as we're going to see shortly. And it started off here with this. James McNeill Whistler, the American artist working in England, was commissioned by a British ship owner for his Kensington house, he wanted a large room in the Persian style, as he put it. And here, McNeill Whistler has obliged beautifully. All this is in gold and black, as you can see, an absolutely stunning recreation, now in a museum, but it was a recreation exactly of the room that he'd done for this. Frederick Leyland was the British shipowner who commissioned this. So now where do we see the actual manifestations? These are all the threads coming together that bring us to this concept of Art Nouveau, and you can already see that it's not a single thing. It has a theme running through it, but it has many different manifestations. The earliest physical manifestations beyond the Peacock Room was actually not in Paris, not in London, but interestingly in Brussels, which at the time had pretensions to rival Paris as a leading art centre. And it was not in painting, and it wasn't in graphic design, but it was in architecture. And Brussels' leading architect at the time was Victor Horta, who starts very cautiously getting away from the flat facade and beginning to pick up the vibe of this movement with this apartment building here. But then he gets a little more courageous. And here you can see a facade. Now we have a bowed window coming in, reflecting this serpentine aesthetic, but in an architectural, very restrained manner. But it's also a masterpiece of materials. Just look at the wonderful white stone there, the ironwork, and masses of glass, which was quite revolutionary. And the glass allowed you to look down into the entrance foyer of this same building. And there you see he's picked up on this aesthetic in no uncertain terms. We have a spiral ascending staircase supported by a slender little iron palm, can you see, branching off and branching off again. And just look at the balustrade there. Ribbons, serpiginous ribbons of iron there, all picked up in a soft graphic on the opposite wall. And I think you would say that that conveys to me a sense of fragile elegance. No detail was spared in this building. It was done for Professor Émile Tessel. Émile Tessel was a professor, clearly wealthy, not locked into some academic appointment, as some of us are. He was able to commission this house, and inside no detail was spared. And you can see here's just a door handle, the same ribbons that we saw in the balustrade going up the stairs, now winding around to create a door handle, somehow hugely original, yet somehow inevitable. Now we turn to Paris to see how the Art Nouveau movement caught on. It caused a startle at the beginning, but now it was the seductive nature was beginning to come home. And it's now 1900, the year of the Great Exposition, International Exhibition in Paris. And the director of the committee managing the Great International Exposition in 1900 wanted an architect to create entrances and pavilions for the metro underground system in Paris that was going to be inaugurated at the same time that the 1900 exposition was going to be open to the public. And the challenge was, would the public go down into the underworld in order to get on these trains? And so he sought around for an architect who would respond to this challenge, and he hit upon Hector Guimard. And Hector Guimard accepted the challenge and designed some 20 pavilions, some modest like this, others more elaborate, and in their wisdom the Parisian municipal authority has chosen to demolish many of the larger ones to make room, but some of them do survive. And here we can see one of the simpler of these pavilions. Here's another one, and we're just looking at the details of the steps as you go down. Can you see the shield here? And here again, harping back to Islamic calligraphy, we can see how that evolved into these scrolls and the ornamental M for Metropolitain on the bottom of the shield there. And putting all that together, we can see there's the Metropolitain using a script, a font that Guimard himself had devised, still present today. You see that in Paris, as you know. The sign is suspended between two lamp standards that look like drooping lilies. And the feeling now is that you're not going into the underworld, and God help you if you even think about getting on the metro train. The feeling now is that you're going down not to get on a train, but to dine at Maxime's. In the more personal terms, one has to leave Paris because nobody else picked up on Art Nouveau in Paris, and we have to go off to the provincial French town of Nancy. And there Émile Gallé, who was the son of a glass and ceramic shop owner, took up the challenge. He was a highly intelligent, sensitive man, as you can see from his face here. And he was university educated in botany. And in the course of his studies, at the end of his studies, he took a trip to London, and in the South Kensington Museum, as it was then known, he came across some Japanese vases. And he was taken by the opalescence of the vases and the shape of the vases, and he thought he could work with that. After all, he'd been brought up in an environment where his father's shop was full of vases and glassware and ceramics. He also, being a botanist, had planted his own garden. And so he wanted to meld the two together, botany and glass manufacturing. And he studied intensely the actual architecture, if you like, of a plant. And he incorporated that in the designs that he did that we're now so familiar with. There's a botanical design taken from his garden. It looks like a cherry blossom, doesn't it? And there it is. And he employed a technique that he thought was unique, and indeed it was unique for many centuries. And that was of strands of molten glass, which he had originally melted together with iron oxides of different metals to produce different colors, glass of different thicknesses, still molten, applied to the surface of a still warm, hot vase, fusing them all together. And this technique really blew everybody away, and even today, I think, if you own an original Gallé vase, that's a treasure to be passed on for the generations. But where did that technique come from? If we think back to Wednesday, do you remember the mosque lamp inside where we saw an etching, a passage from the Quran etched that the light of Allah will shine in Arabic, and there it is etched in glass, very much the same sort of concept of applying glass. And together with that, we saw that vase, do you remember, with the coloured strands of glass that had been applied to the surface. So in the Middle East, 1,000 years earlier, glassware had reached the same level of sophistication as Gallé. Perhaps this is more in keeping with the aesthetic of the times for us, but nonetheless the technique had already been there 1,000 years earlier. And unknown to me, and I suspect unknown to many of you too, Gallé was a great producer of furniture. And look at this lovely cabinet that he produced in marquetry. Again, the botanical theme coming through, the swirl of the wood there going across the front. And then most stunning of all is this bed. Émile Gallé, bed, sunrise, sunset. And it's now in a museum, of course. How wonderful to have ordered this, can you imagine? On the headboard, you have the sunrise. You have the curves parting in order to see the sunrise and the landscape behind. And then at the foot of the bed, you have the rays of the setting sun, everything picked out in mother of pearl on the footboard. What a magnificent piece, I think you would agree. And then for the lady who had it all, another glassmaker had found a little niche, René Lalique. He produced vases very much like Gallé, but Gallé seemed to collar the market and the prestige. And so he turned to satisfying the whims of wealthy ladies who had a great deal of self-confidence, as you can imagine, to wear a brooch like this. And he did a whole lot of insect brooches, and this one is in gold, in crystal, and in jade. And these are the sort of things. And you can see the curvaceous spirit is there. This is not just the smoking candle. Everything has to be like that. Not at all. Art Nouveau is more a spirit than a design. That Boehner's original drawing of the candle and the smoke gives you an idea of the nucleus of Art Nouveau, but that's not the end of the story by a long shot. It's a spirit of the times, a spirit of movement, and we'll see that manifest in many different ways in just a moment. As far as the visual artists are concerned, the great painters of Paris of the late 19th century, it passed them by almost entirely. An exception, perhaps, is the eccentric Paul Gauguin, always full of himself. And there he is, he paints his self-portrait behind a Serpiginus, and if you like, you can say, well, that's a nod to Art Nouveau. He'd given himself a halo here because it was painted, it was not because he's a great artist, but he was very proud of himself. He had resisted the temptation to seduce his landlady while painting in Brittany. He gave him a halo, he didn't deserve it, and the reason he was successful in resisting his impulses was that she was already having an affair with one of her other customers. True story. Toulouse-Lautrec has also just pays a sort of passing acquaintance with Art Nouveau there. I don't think you can say there's terribly much about it. But he has, after all, taken the scroll of this double bass and whisked it across the field there in a curving manner to give a frame, and also the bobbing hair of the bass player there as he bobs up and down in time with the music. The one graphic artist who picked up on Art Nouveau and ran with it was the Czech designer Alphonse Mucha, who spent his whole professional career in Paris. And did he run with it? And here we can see a dancer who's leapt up there, the curve of the wake that she's left behind as she's leapt up into this circle. There she is with her billowing dress and her flowing hair, like of which no one had ever seen before. And that really is back to the very essence again, but here magnified in spades, if you like, in Mucha's graphic drawings here. And if that isn't enough for you, what about this? And this is another Mucha poster, and it is for Job. And what in goodness name is Job? Well, Job is actually, can you believe, a cigarette paper manufacturer. What could be more prosaic than that? And here she is in ecstasy as the fumes from her cigarette waft past her. Thank goodness those days are over. So speaks the physician. There we are. And her hair there, if we thought that Mucha's hair before was Art Nouveau on steroids, I'm not sure what you're going to call this. And now we cross the Pyrenees to see another take on Art Nouveau. And that, of course, is in Spain's greatest architect, Antoni Gaudí. Many of you have seen his work, a Catalan whose work is almost entirely in Barcelona, and almost every work that he created is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which speaks for how much esteem in which he's held. As a youngster, he was a bit of a dandy, as you can suspect there. He never married, and he became increasingly recluse-like as he became more and more religious, preoccupied with his major work, of course, which we're going to see shortly. His first major commission occurred early in his life, and he was commissioned by a very wealthy Spanish shipowner, Eusebio Güell. And Eusebio Güell, being in shipping, wanted a townhouse in Barcelona that would compare to the palazzo of the Venetian owners. And he wanted a Venetian palace. And Gaudí's working method was curious for an architect, in that he didn't work from plans. He worked from models, and most of it was in his head anyway. And as a consequence, none of his projects ended up how they were intended or how he had intended. They morphed as time went on, and we see that in all his work. But Güell was very understanding and admired what he did, and this is the end result. So is it a Venetian palazzo? Well, not really, but I think we've got some vertical elements there. So as an architect, you have to pay lip service to what went before, and there is the Gothic in the windows, the long vertical lines there you can see. Looking a bit like, but he's put some scrolls at the bottom in metalwork, rather oriental calligraphic-like, making those vertical windows look more like the windows where the ladies of the harem look out. So that's the feeling it gives. But what was so striking here is not just the harem balcony there, but those arches underneath the actual entrance. And as you look there in detail at the entrances, nothing like this had ever been seen before. And this is Gaudí. Nothing that Gaudí did had ever been seen before. Parabolic entrances like this. There's no precedent in architecture that I'm aware of, nor indeed I suspect was Gaudí. Not only does he do these parabolic arches as a means of getting into the building, he's covered the upper third with some ironwork, with scrolls and whorls, as you can see, which is the same motif we've been talking about. And when seen from the inside, you can just see the enormous density of the curves and scrolls. So here's Art Nouveau on steroids again, but confined just to that little area. And this is all what Gaudí is all about. He also designed furniture, can you believe? And here you may say, oh, well, that's a sort of Regency dressing table. Well, it is a little bit in one side, but there's the mirror with curved border going all around, as you can see, at this curious jaunty angle. And the work surface of the dressing table is supported by the wood that curves down and then descends down into these legs. And on the left-hand side, it looks for all the world as though he's carved in wood kinky boots. Güell also wanted, he was a very rich man, and he wanted a recreational place, like a sort of holiday home, if you like, and just on the outskirts of Barcelona, he wanted Gaudí to create a series of pavilions, which he did in semi-oriental style. And here is the gate to get into the enclosure of Gaudí's pavilions, and you can see it's in the form of a dragon. So when the gate is closed, you had to be jolly sure that you were expected and you were a welcome guest. There's a dragon with his teeth, his claws bared, the wings of the dragon there giving off these strands of metal which curve around, and there's the dragon's tail. So it's just all the versatility, the things that go through the mind of this extraordinary man. And he also designed a private park for the Güell family to recreate in on the hill overlooking Barcelona. It's now a public park. And in it were large, long serpentine benches like the back of a switchback or a long snake covered in tiles where you could rest, covered pavilions. And on the steps going up, you're greeted by this tiled-covered, grinning salamander. To my mind, his most satisfying building in Barcelona itself is this building, the Casa Batlló, for the Batlló family. And Gaudí didn't actually construct the building, it was already there, but he was charged by the family to modify the facade. And you can see that he's done that, and he not only modified the facade, he modified the roofline. And as we look at that in some detail, then you can see the genius of this man and where he was coming from. And I'll draw your attention to the second floor loggia. Can you see above the red area where the lights are reflecting from the ground floor rooms? The floor above that, you can see, is like a projecting loggia. And the balcony of the floor above that is supported by what looked like to me to be the thigh bones of a dinosaur. Can you see those curving up there? Most extraordinary. And to indicate that I'm not sort of making that up, if you go inside the building, go up into the second floor and look back, this is what you see. The same dinosaur bones reproduced on the inside that are present on the outside there, the wavy, curvy lines of the window frames, the discs of circles of flowers there looking out now over the streets of Barcelona. Art Nouveau, well, not sure what you're going to call it. It's got lots of curves in, but there's it's a big, broad church, Art Nouveau, and this is Gaudí's interpretation in that particular way. Take yourself not to the second floor, but up onto the roof. And now we're on the roof of the Batlló building. And there we can see these plaques of ceramics all the way up, and for all the world, you're sitting astride the back of a dinosaur. You are indeed extraordinary. His masterwork, of course, is the church of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which was started in 1882 by another architect who was charged with designing a entirely Gothic church. And the architect there, you can still see in Gaudí's rendition here, you can see the verticals there of the conical chapels. You can see rose windows on the left side there down at the bottom, respecting the original architect's plan. But within a year, that architect resigned, I'm not sure why, but then Gaudí, who was an apprentice to that architect, took over. And without any plans at all, just a few models and what was on his head, for the next 40 years, he labored on this until he died in 1926, when it was just 1/4 complete. Today, it is the most single-visited site in the whole of Spain. The great feature of this is the way that Gaudí has accepted a background of Gothic architecture, but modified it in a way that is uniquely Gaudí and pays more than just lip service to Art Nouveau. Its main feature are the spires. And according to the records that Gaudí left, and there are not very many, he had intended there to be 18 spires. 12 for the apostles, 4 for the evangelists, 1 for the Virgin, and 1 for Christ. And so far, we've got as far as 8. But whether we're going to get the other 10, I'm not really sure. But in this particular view, you can see nicely how he has respected the original Gothic theme there. But it's only when we look at the details of the walls and the entrances and around the windows that we see Gaudí in his element. If we just focus on the blue bits, the windows there, you can say, well, those are not quite rose windows in this particular part, but you can see there's a Gothic heritage here. But look what surrounds them, all this massive foliage, just like William Morris and the calligraphy that we saw, and this is vegetation in abundance, among which we find neo-Gothic figures. There's a choir of children singing at the bottom there, accompanied on the bottom left-hand corner there by 2 string musicians, above them a bassoonist, can you see? And on the right there, towards the top, somebody playing a harp. And when you go inside the Sagrada Familia, you now see this is a fisheye view, so you have just to adjust your eye to the distortion of the camera lens. You can pick up a classic rose window on the right-hand side there, but now we're looking right up under the roof there, capturing as much as we can with the fisheye lens, and you can see the slender columns that we saw in Victor Horta's tassel house there that supported that staircase that blew us away when we first saw it just a moment or two ago. Gaudí has adopted that same principle, fine, slender palm trees, branches going off from the top of the palm tree, themselves then dividing yet again in order to support the roof. So, and all in different colours, as you can see. So idiosyncratic is this man. Even more idiosyncratic is what is not on the picture, and what's not on the picture is what these columns are resting on. They're resting on the back of stone tortoises. Every single detail was Gaudí's creation. Here's just some stone carving of a decorative element. But then in 1926, he was already a bit of a recluse. He was no longer eating properly. He didn't wash his clothes. Everything was very shabby. And one morning, his whole life was now for his Sagrada Familia church. And that was his total devotion. His total preoccupation was, what am I going to do today? What is the next step? And as he was walking, he didn't notice that he was crossing over a tram line. He was knocked over by a tram and severely injured. And the passers-by thought, well, he's just a sort of tramp, and eventually somebody takes pity on him, summons an ambulance, and he's taken to the local hospital and lies on a gurney there for 3 days while somebody tries to find out who he is. But before they do, he dies. And it is only then they realize that this was Catalonia's and Spain's and perhaps one of Europe's greatest architects. Just to finish the story, in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI paid a visit and accorded the Sagrada Familia, which is now perhaps 3/4 finished, given it the title of a minor basilica. And you say, well, that's a bit mean. Why minor? And the reason is it couldn't overshadow the basilica in Barcelona itself. So he had to come up with this sort of compromise. But in other words, it was acknowledging the importance of this work that is scheduled to be completed in 2032, but that could easily be pushed back. So that's in Spain. What happened across Central Europe? In Germany, architects were very hesitant to embrace this. But some enterprising publisher did decide to start a magazine reflecting the art, and you can see this is Mucha, isn't it, the curves of the hair there, reflecting this new aesthetic which thinks that Germany ought to at least acknowledge, if not fully wholeheartedly embrace, and started a magazine called Die Jugend, the youth. In other words, it was a young, fresh art movement that was available for anybody to exploit as they wished. But Die Jugend, the publisher, was in Munich, and Munich was a major art center, as we discovered Kandinsky had chosen to go there to do his art studies rather than Berlin. But Berlin wasn't going to have their southern neighbor being upstarts, so it started its own art magazine called Pan, after the Greek god of nature. And here you can see that this was a high-class magazine, better quality finish, and they actually sought articles from Munch, from Leger, from a whole host of people, Beardsley, Toulouse-Lautrec submitted articles and illustrations for them. This was an upmarket magazine, the other was a more popular magazine, introducing the concept, but it never really took off in Germany. But Germany was very close to Austria, and in Austria it did, in a unique way. In Austria, and Vienna in particular, Vienna has a problem. It's a good problem to have, and that is the wonderful Baroque palaces that fill Vienna. And any of us who visited that can just marvel and absorb the atmosphere of the Baroque period. Some people regard Art Nouveau as a sort of new Baroque. Well, okay, I won't argue with that. But it's a real problem for contemporary architects. How are you going to put up contemporary buildings in Vienna, which is so full of these magnificent Baroque palaces? And so Vienna's leading architect around the turn of the century, Otto Wagner, hit upon a compromise. And the compromise he hit upon was to have a very plain building so as not to eclipse the Baroque buildings nearby, and his is the 2/3 on the right there. And you can see, if you just take away all the decoration for a moment, it's a plain building with simple rectangular windows and balconies down one side. And now he's gone to town a little bit by decorating this otherwise very austere-looking building, not with stucco or curves in stone, but simply with tiles, as you can see, floral tiles. But respecting the severity, not the severity, respecting the restraint of the rectangular forms to be as a foil to the flamboyance of the Baroque architecture, he employed geometry as a major theme. And if we look at the decorations at the top there in some detail, we can see exactly what he achieved. He he embellishes, if you like, covers his very plain, rather boring facade with the flowers and the stems there, but now he employs geometry. Can you see the circles there and the 3 straps coming down, the vertical? The combination of the floral flamboyance in a restrained tones of colour, so as not to be in your face and conflict with the Baroque buildings, but at the same time as a foil to the geometry. So it's a push and pull between the restraint of geometry and the restrained flamboyance of the flowers and the plants. And who should pick up on that combination but Vienna's leading artist, Gustav Klimt? And you may say, what on earth's that got to do with that building? Well, just look at the details. It's his famous kiss, of course, lovers encased in a gold-coloured cape, embracing on a flower-decked hill. But look at the decoration of their cape. What do we see? Exactly the same as Otto Wagner, the combination of the flowers on one side and the rectangles on the other side, an interplay between the two. And I hadn't really noticed that, and I really hadn't made this linkage at all. But the minute you make the linkage, it's absolutely obvious, isn't it? There's this common theme. So this is how the aesthetics of Art Nouveau is allowed to morph in different directions. And then we move across to England, and here we see yet another morphing of Art Nouveau in the form of Beardsley. Beardsley was coming from a privileged family. He was born in Brighton, and no doubt that Nash's Oriental Pavilion in Brighton coloured his way of thinking, but he was a dandy of all dandies, to the point that he dyed his hair green, he wore dove grey suits with waistcoat, and without fail in his buttonhole, not a blue carnation, as Oscar Wilde had done, but a dying rose. And that was a mandatory part of his equipment. Why? Perhaps sadly so, because he contracted tuberculosis before he was a teenager. And in those days, if you contracted tuberculosis, all bets were off as to whether you were going to survive or not. So he suspected his life was going to be short, and indeed it was. He died at the height of his career. What did he do? Well, he wanted to be a designer. He was a very flamboyant individual, as you can surmise from that. His first commission came at the age of 21, when he was asked if he would please produce some illustrations for Sir Thomas Malory's story, Le Morte d'Arthur, the story of the mythical King Arthur of England and the Knights of the Round Table. And what does that remind you, of course? And that was, of course, the Kelmscott Press and William Morris. So William Morris was a great hero of Beardsley, and you can say the same border that we saw there, that we saw earlier, 1,000 years earlier in the Mosque in Damascus, there it is again, now appearing in Beardsley's work. And here's just a scene for that, The Lady of the Lake. And that was a commission that earned him some money and began to earn him some recognition. But then he went to Paris, just on a trip, and in Paris they're the prints that we saw. Remember, we talked about these on Tuesday, the woodblock prints. And what was so striking, before they were coloured, what struck Beardsley was how visually arresting they were in their black and white form. And you can see the liberal use of black there that the Japanese woodblock printers had used, the fine lines of form, a plain background. And this immediately registered with Beardsley that this is an aesthetic to which he could respond and he could go up and run with. And indeed he did. And Toulouse-Lautrec, he saw as well, had borrowed the same idea, the boldness of the black, although the background there served a slightly different purpose. And now he has a commission, and this is on what his reputation is made, a commission from Oscar Wilde, who had just completed his version of the story of Salome. Salome, you remember, was the king, Herod's daughter, who demanded the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And he's asked to produce illustrations for the whole of this story. And arresting they are in the extreme. And here is Salome contemplating the severed head, blood dripping on the ground there, as you can see. And you can see the Art Nouveau elements if you define Art Nouveau as broadly as I hope I've encouraged you to do. The curls of the hair there, you can see the collar hanging down in scallops and the lines going off in different angles. And the boldness of the black and on the white from the Japanese aesthetic that we saw a little earlier. And now we reach a moment of ecstasy. Here is Salome about to kiss the lips of the severed head of John the Baptist. She leaps in the air, grabs him by the ears, and plunges her mouth towards his. Notice his hair, like Medusa, snakes curving around, blood dripping down, and from the blood, in Beardsley's imagination, a lily blooms, can you see there? And just at the moment she gives him a kiss, we see a burst of orgasmic bubbles. And perhaps his most celebrated illustration for the Salome story is here, where Salome addresses a young Syrian, according to the story. And here he's borrowed the Persian motif of the peacock feathers. Remember, we saw that in Leyland's room in Kensington, in his Kensington house. And here, what Whistler had done in that room in gold, Beardsley now does in black and white, the motif. And you can see the curves, and you can see the family resemblance to the original curves of Art Nouveau that we saw in Maxime's restaurant or in the metro station. But you can see that here, the same principle. It's a spirit rather than a strict illustrative formula. It's a spirit. And here is his beauty. And what's so successful about this, of course, is the complexity of the decoration on the skirt with the plain white form of Salome's back. And who picks up on that? Again, our friend Gustav Klimt, and I'm sure this was 10 years later, and he was well aware of Beardsley, and I suspect that that highly decorated dress was a feature here that led him to do this celebrated portrait of the Viennese socialite Adele Bloch-Bauer. He also went on to produce a lot of erotic drawings, and I had to scan through dozens of them before I could find one I could show you. And I will show you this one only briefly. There we are. His great patron for this, what made his reputation, was, of course, Oscar Wilde. And there's Oscar Wilde with Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. The story there I can't really tell you because I've got other things to cover, but it's a fascinating story, and we can talk about that over lunch. Let's move north to Scotland, and there Arthur McMurdo embraces fully the essence of Art Nouveau in its most graphic form. There we are. This is a Queen Anne chair which he modified. Can you see the back of that? What could be more sumptuous than that? The wave there breaking up into the stems, which in turn give off seeds and give off flowers, as you can see there. And there he uses the same idea here for the frontispiece of a book that he's just published on Wren's city churches. And again, the essence of Art Nouveau in the more traditional way that we understand it. And then across the way in Glasgow, we now have somebody who has a close affinity with the Viennese architect Wagner. Can you see, remember Wagner, the flowers and the verticals? And this, of course, is Charles René Mackintosh, who earned his reputation by redesigning the Glasgow Art School, which has sadly done badly through a fire and neglect, and it really looks rather sad. But architecturally, it was a major advance in its day. But the one part of Mackintosh's work that has survived is a reconstruction of his famous willow tea room, which still serves cream teas if you go to Glasgow today. And this is the door to the deluxe room that he designed. And can you recognize the same things there that we saw in that building in Vienna? The vertical stripes picked out in mother of pearl, the little swirls are there. So it's a restrained form of Art Nouveau, combining the geometry and the floral, and which is something that's going to develop in just a moment, as we're going to see. As you go into the willow room, there we have the chairs, the verticals of the window, the full expanse looking over a rather nondescript shopping street in Glasgow, but the chairs there and the restrained colours. give you a wonderful sense of occasion if you've been there. In America, Art Nouveau had its own particular way of proceeding, and it didn't really take off with the exception of Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan is the father of the Chicago skyscraper school, the pioneer of the skyscraper. And he's also famous not only for pioneering skyscraper architecture, but for a maxim which is the yardstick by which all architects worthy of the name should work. And that is that